Hey listeners, welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. Today's our 46th episode, and I know you're going to like it because I really liked it. And so without further ado, here is my conversation with Pat Flynn on the problem of evil. Enjoy. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. Today, I am joined by Pat Flynn to discuss a very big topic in philosophy, which is the problem of evil. Pat Flynn is an award-winning writer, author of 5, soon-to-be 6 books, trainer of special forces and professional athletes, and those who are neither. Academically, Pat has a background in economics, undergrad, and philosophy, master's. He records music on the weekends as well. Pat, welcome to the Logos Project.
It's a pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Anytime. I've been looking forward to this conversation because I actually had a very long debate with a friend of mine on the problem of evil. I think I won him over to my side, but there's still some unresolved questions. It was about the question of free will. Does that explain away moral evil? And I'm sure we'll get into that. But
oh, yes, we shall. It's a big one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I guess what I'll do is I'll kind of kick it off with a general question, and then we can get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah.
The general question is a problem of evil a good argument against God existence, or should we dismiss it as irrelevant? What do you think?
Well, I don't think it's a good argument, as in I don't think it's successful. I don't think it gives any good reason to believe that God does not exist. However, I don't want to say that we should dismiss it. I mean, this is the perennial issue that people struggle with. So I think it deserves a lot of respect. It deserves a lot of attention. And it deserves it because it's a deep existential issue as well, right? Not just something we think about in our rationally reflective moments in the ivory tower, right? It's something that hits us right in the gut. So, at the end of the day, I don't think it's a good argument, right? I don't think somebody should give up theistic belief or their religion because they're faced with the problem of evil. However, I do want to say that I can see how people could reasonably feel pressure from the experience of evil against belief in God. I think that I want to say, no, that can be a reasonable pressure to feel.
Yeah.
But once we do the sober analysis, we'll see that that evil is not good evidence against the existence of God. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And actually that's a perfect transition into the different aspects of the conversation, which is when we address this topic of the problem of evil, is there a distinction between the pastoral approach and the philosophical one? You kind of mentioned the ivory tower approach.
Yeah. So it's really problems of evil, and it's problems of evil on many different levels. So you've got the, call it the practical problem of evil, or the pastoral problem of evil, or the experience problem of evil, whatever you want to call it, right? There's just we live with evil. What do we do about it? How are we supposed to respond?
Yeah.
What do we do when somebody is just in the grips of suffering, which is a lot of us a lot of the time? Should we go and give somebody a sort of extended theodicy in relation to cosmological arguments? Probably not. That would probably be wildly inappropriate, right? Should we lend them a friend's ear? Should we try to alleviate their suffering? All those are really important, right? On the level of experience in life. How do we help people? How do we try to alleviate their suffering and help them to grow in holiness? That I think that's what you're talking about, the pastoral problem. And maybe, and I don't want to say that philosophy is irrelevant there. I think philosophy can provide a consolation. I mean, it's one of the greatest philosophical works of all time. It's called The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. And he's just being consoled by good philosophy in the midst of terrible suffering. But I don't think that's always appropriate for everybody, especially if they're not, coming from a philosophical perspective. So at least for our conversation, I kind of want to bracket that off because I'm not a pastor, and God bless pastors, but that's not what I am. I live in the philosophical circle. So what I'm interested in both, but what I'm competent to speak on, what I've thought a lot more about, is the philosophical problem of evil. Or call it the theoretical problem evil, or the intellectual problem evil. Call it whatever you want. It's the so many different terms all the time, right? It's this is just trying to understand whether there's compatibility between the world we live in that has all these seeming imperfections and even atrocities on the one hand, and the existence of God, and not just any old God, but a particular type of God, the all-powerful, all-good God, and trying to see, are these things that can fit together? Are they compatible, or are they not? That's the philosophical problem of evil. And it's important having these conversations to be upfront that we are drawing this distinction, because when you're doing philosophy, it can sometimes seem very cold and abstract and almost unfeeling. But that's just the nature of philosophy. And that's not meant to diminish or downplay the real experiential problem of evil. They're just different aspects of the problem of evil.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. That's an important groundwork to lay before we jump into the philosophy. And so that being said, though, let's go ahead and maybe tackle the and you can take this wherever you want, but let's maybe start with natural evil. The way I phrased it was, when it comes to the question I sent to you, was, why would God allow natural evils, and how is this compatible with this kind of Genesis vision of, for example, like the modern sciences talk about evolution, this kind of natural selection world of survival. How is that compatible? Why would God allow such a creation to be, so destructive, and, the second law of thermodynamics, stuff like that?
Right. Yeah. So let's actually back up and do some more stage setting, because I think it's important to come in with the right perspective and background on this. Otherwise, I think you'll go in a lot of circles. First off, we have to make some initial distinctions between theism and the problem of evil and Christianity and the problem of evil.
I see.
I mean, we just have to, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise, we're just going to constantly, I think, be crossing streams. Now, I think that Christianity offers additional resources for dealing with the problem of evil. But we're first just concerned with what's called a broad theism, the existence of the God of classical theism and the problem of evil. Then we can kind of zoom in and see, okay, how is this compatible with Christian commitments and divine revelation and interpretations of Genesis and stuff like that? Does that make sense, Dom?
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, again, I think you can just go in too many directions at once, and it's not going to bring the conceptual clarity that we're looking for.
Yeah.
Okay. Background first. All right. So first off, before we start trying to answer why does God allow this and why does God allow that, we should first ask, well, do I have good reason to think that God exists in the first place, right? And in one sense, there's a very simple solution to the problem of evil. And that is, if you think two things are actual, then they have to be compatible, right? And, well, this world is actual, and we think there's a lot of suffering in it. But God's actual too. So they have to be compatible, right? And now somebody might find that deeply unsatisfying, but I want to say, if you already have what you think are either demonstrative metaphysical proofs for God, or at least really strong reason that God is actual, and then you obviously believe that this world is actual too, well, then they just have to be compatible, even if you don't see how they go together. So, for example, maybe you think that, okay, there's a lot of kind of stuff in the natural world that I don't like, or that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me right now. And we'll talk about that in a minute. However, it does seem right to me to think that there would be no natural world unless there were a necessary and supreme foundation, right? Whatever else the natural world is, it's contingent, it's finite, it's composite, it's sort of filled with potency. And all of these types of things are the sort of categories that always cry out for an extrinsic explanation. They're not self-sufficient. They're not self-explanatory, right? Such that if this was all there was in the world, we wouldn't have a sufficient condition for the world. There would be no world.
Yeah.
Right? There just wouldn't be a natural world, let alone natural evils at all. So it does seem right to me to think that the fact that there is any world at all, let alone this world, there has to be the necessary precondition for that. And this is where the traditional metaphysics comes in. It says, look, the fact that we have compositeness, act potency composites, essence existence composites, the fact that we have contingency, right? All this demands, not just indicates, but demands that we have to make a category shift to get the adequate explanation. That category shift means we have to get to something that is purely actual, that is non-contingent, whose essence just is existence, right? Okay. That seems clear to me, Dom. And what I want to say is, when it comes to the problem of evil, what we should always be doing is we should always be using what is clear to shine light on what is unclear, right? So if it's unclear to you at first why God allows certain things, that's what we call a puzzle. That's a puzzle. We don't see how these things fit together, but that doesn't mean that we see that they don't fit together.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and if I already see that God has to exist for there to be a world, I mean, these just are the traditional arguments for God, right? They're just like,
Yeah.
they all say in different ways, look, if no God, no world, world therefore God, right? So if it's clear to me that we need God to have a world, that's clear to me, then I should privilege what is clear to what is not clear. It's not clear to me that God and evil can't fit together, but it is clear to me that if God didn't exist, there wouldn't even be a problem evil, because there just wouldn't be anything at all.
Absolutely. This reminds me a lot of the conversation that Bishop Barron had with Alex O'Connor, I think was his name, where Alex would start from the problem of evil and deduce further conclusions from there, while Bishop Barron would start with the contingency of the universe, the necessity of first cause. I was reading earlier today, I think it was yesterday, Father Norris Clark, when he talks about in his awesome book, The One of the Many, talks about the fact that things that have composition, things that begin, things that are part of a system, they require an efficient cause. And ultimately, you need an efficient cause that is purely simple, has no beginning, all that kind of stuff. All the stuff you're talking about, basically going through Thomas's proofs and the metaphysics that undergirds that. You start there with goodness, existence, and then you try, like you said, to explain evil. But Alex was starting with the problem of evil. So I think you're right. I think what we have here is a methodological approach. You have to look at the method before you even look at the data, if that makes any sense. And I really like that as an approach.
Yeah, and this is why I wanted to do the stage setting, because yes, you're right. Method matters.
Yeah.
Your sort of background perspective makes a big difference on this, and we shouldn't just let the skeptic just have things that they're not entitled to, right?
Yeah.
Whatever else the problem of evil is, it depends on an enormous number of conditions to even be intelligible, right? First off, to even have this conversation about the problem of evil requires commitments to things like moral principles and moral standards, conscious rational agents, a contingent universe, physical fine-tuning, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So even if you want to put the sort of deeper metaphysical proofs aside and just do kind of traditional worldview comparison, where you say, what worldview would better lead me to anticipate that data, right? And we've got classical theism here, and we've got some form of naturalism there. Yeah, I have to say, Dom, I don't think there would be a problem of evil if naturalism were true, because it doesn't seem to me that naturalism can account for any of the necessary conditions for us to even have a conversation about the problem of evil to begin with. And now this is important, because if you're looking at the data and you're asking, well, does that data count in favor of this hypothesis or that hypothesis?
Yeah.
Right. You have to ask, well, how expected would that data be given this hypothesis versus that hypothesis? And what I'm arguing is, even if you think that this world has a sort of low likelihood given the existence of God, like what's the sort of degree of expectation you would have that God would create a world like this with the suffering and evil?
Yeah.
Even if you think it's like 1%, what I'm going to argue is that it's far lower on naturalism, if not 0%.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I just would not expect any of the features that we experience in this world, including our moral judgments. And also, let's not forget moral knowledge. Naturalists have a dang hard time trying to account for moral knowledge, right?
Yeah.
And we need these features to even make the problem of evil intelligible. So I don't think the likelihood of the problem of evil is low on theism, but I'm saying you can even grant the skeptic that and say, look, maybe you think it's 1%. Fine, fair. But it's the ratio that matters. So what's the expectation on naturalism? Frankly, my honest assessment is 0%.
Yeah.
But even if it's not 0%, it's far, far, far lower on a naturalistic paradigm than it is a theistic paradigm. And in that sense, if we're looking at the data, then I would argue on substantial analysis, the data points to the existence of God rather than away. So whatever method you want to take, the deeper metaphysical analysis or the classic sort of worldview comparison using, the machinery of Bayes and all that, I think either way, it's favorable for theism.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. You're talking a lot about I think I heard you mention this in one of your episodes. You talk about paradigms and looking at the data and what paradigm fits best the data, knowing that there's always going to be tensions and issues in all paradigms.
Yeah.
So you go with the most plausible one, the one that covers the most data, and then you work out the puzzle. And I really like that approach, especially in a world where, we want a lot of certainty, and then we bump into things that, like the problem of evil. Like, how could God allow this awful, terrible thing to happen? It doesn't make sense to me. But if you approach it from that small, narrow experience,
Mhm.
I think ultimately it's not going to be healthy or helpful.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, right? It's only if you look at it from a very superficial analysis
Yeah.
that it might seem like evil favors an atheistic paradigm.
Yeah.
But again, like whatever else evil depends on, say evolution of complex, intelligent, rational, conscious agents, right? That somehow link up to moral standards and moral principles.
Yeah.
What's the probability of that on an atheistic universe? I think it's zero.
Yeah.
But evolution depends on physical fine tuning. And the epistemic probability of physical fine tuning on atheism, like, I don't think you can overcome that challenge, right?
Yeah.
Whereas theism easily explains and predicts that, right? So you see, like, evil is contingent upon all these other factors that theism predicts and explains really well. In fact, it's just the sort of thing I would sort of anticipate on the theistic paradigm. Whereas the naturalistic paradigm, it just can't do it, right? It really doesn't have the resources unless you start sort of wiring up your atheistic theory with all sorts of additional ad hoc components, in which case you're going to have this enormously convoluted, complex theory that is just going to be so intrinsically unlikely that it's like impossible to even take it seriously to begin with. And that's how the sort of worldview comparison goes. So my approach is like, look, you don't just get to just like claim victory from the superficial analysis. We have to look at our total understanding, right?
Yeah.
We have to do a substantial analysis. And when I think you do that, you'll see, no, on atheism, I wouldn't even expect there to be a problem of evil, because I don't even see how you get the conditions online for us to even have a conversation like this. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. Yeah. So, okay. That being said, now we do have the conditions online. Theism, God does exist.
Yeah.
So why the heck, not just like physically, but metaphysically, right? Not just the second law of thermodynamics, but I guess just animals tearing each other apart.
Yeah, why the natural world? Yeah, let's go into it, right? So first off, what I wanted to do at first was issue what's sort of called a defense, right? And a defense is different from a theodicy. A defense is where the theist is up against the atheistic problem of evil, and they're saying, "Look, buddy, this is why it doesn't succeed.
Yeah,
you clearly haven't been able to show any strict logical contradiction between God and evil, right? And most atheists admit that the strong form logical problem of evil is kind of dead. You get a few that try and resuscitate it every now and then, but it always suffers from the same problems, is they just can't draw out what the contradiction exactly is supposed to be between a perfect creator and an imperfect world. It hasn't been done. I would argue it can't be done. So what they try and push towards is the more evidential problem of evil. Say evil counts as evidence to whatever degree against God. And that's where I would just say pretty much all the other things that I just said, right? That's a defense. And that's just showing, look, this is why the argument against God doesn't work. And that's all the theist needs to do, right? I'm not under an obligation to give a detailed account of why this bad thing happens or that. It's the atheist who has the burden of proof if they're making the argument. So I just want to be clear that all the theist really needs is a defense. However, I want to say that most of us do want more just personally, right? Like we want what's called a theodicy, or some type of story or narrative that helps us to make sense of why God really allows bad things to happen, not just to good people, but also to bad people, and why there is this suffering that goes on in the world. So
yeah,
I just think it's important to make those distinctions to understand what's going on, because I often sometimes see a lot of theists in popular conversations kind of like pinned against the wall, feeling like they need to give like a really robust theodicy,
yeah,
not understanding that it's the atheists making the argument. They're the ones that have to make the argument, right?
yeah.
It's not the theist's burden to give a completely satisfactory theodicy, right? For a theist, a defense is all that's needed to diffuse the problem of evil. Is that clear? Does that make sense?
No, very much so. We don't have that much burden because they're the ones bringing this challenge.
Yes, correct. Yeah. All right. Now, and I'm not trying to dodge the question by any means. I'm just trying to say I think this is the right way to handle it. All right. Natural world. Okay. Well, there's a lot of good traditional answers to this. One answer is why did God sort of create a world where certain things increase, other things decrease, right? And the traditional answer to that is that's just the nature of materiality, dude, right? It's just sort of concomitant with the very nature of material beings, that they are subject to corruption and decay. So the traditional answer is like, look, if you want trees and you want fire, then it's just going to be the nature of things that fire can corrupt trees. You want lions, you want gazelles, it's just the nature of lions to eat gazelles. The flourishing of the lion, right, demands the diminishment of the gazelle. And I think what we want to say here is if somebody's pressing against the evils of the natural order, what they're really saying is why maybe God shouldn't have created a natural order at all, or at least a material order. Maybe God should have just stopped with the angels. And that's what I want to say is what they're really saying if they don't realize it, because they haven't thought deeply enough about the metaphysics, as you pointed out, of what it means to be a material reality to begin with. And certainly in the traditional paradigm, it just means to be the type of thing that is subject to corruption and decay. It means to be the type of thing that when in interaction with other things, certain things flourish, other things diminish, right? And we see this through the material world, through the ecosystem. So to say like that you wouldn't want that is really to say that you just think that God shouldn't have created a material world. And what I want to say at that point is if that's what you think, then there's something wrong with you, right? Because I don't think any of us, if given the option to hit a button and could just delete the material world, that we would do it. No, most of us would say, no, this is worth having. This is a good thing, right? Even if we could just zoom out and just like stand outside the physical universe, who would hit that button and say, I would rather it not be there, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we'd rather it without the moral evil, but we're not there yet. We're just talking about natural evil. No, I think everyone would say, I would much rather have this than not. On the whole, this is not just a good thing, but a really good thing. And if you think that, presumably God thought that too. And so it's worth having. And it's sort of just a package deal. It's a package deal that if there's going to be a material reality, especially one that's ordered towards a sort of universal whole that is integrated, and there's a sort of a whole or composite good, it's just going to be the case that things interact, and the flourishing of one thing is the diminishment of another thing, right? But go ahead, chime in. Mm-hmm.
Well, so I've been thinking about that. Couldn't God have created a material universe that's more spiritualized, like more in line with the spirit? So basically we're because you hear these accounts of new creation in the Bible, and I get this is not the Christian argument, but still, couldn't God, on a theist paradigm, have created a world with a material world with less destruction? I don't know, or is that just incompatible with the very nature? Because we talk about the resurrection of the body, and the idea of
right,
more unity between all peoples and animals and creation.
Yeah. So I think like he could have subtracted lions, but why to preserve gazelles? But at that point, or here's the other thing, right? If you want a lion that doesn't eat gazelles, you have something that looks like a lion that isn't a lion, right? You see what I mean? Like it is the nature of lions to operate in that manner. And I think once you start playing that game, you're just going to eventually subtract all the material world again, right? Now we do want to say this if we're switching now to Christianity. We want to say a couple of things. One, God is not just a creator, he's a governor. And he's going to govern things according to their nature. And it's just the nature of material beings to be of the sort that corrupt and decay. And Aquinas thought this was true even of us in the garden, right?
Yeah.
In the garden. So Aquinas doesn't make a special exception for Adam and Eve. He says that what really happened is God sort of gave us special graces, right, to preserve us. Now, it's important from a Christian paradigm, because from a Christian paradigm, humans are not just a part of a whole. They're a whole within a whole. Right. So this means that whatever else the sort of ordering of the world is, it actually sort of has humanity as a central focus. Right. And that's going to change your perspective on a lot of things. Right. So everything else from the Christian paradigm really needs to be seen in perspective of the Imago Dei and the very special place that human beings have in it. Now, that offers, I think, additional resources to the problem of natural evil. So I was trying not to cross streams, but now I will, because I think Christianity offers additional resources. That is that one of the other reasons that God might allow or permit the corruption of the natural world is to use those evils to drive us to our supreme good, right? So we don't become complacent in the natural world and fall short of what we are ultimately intended for, which is the beatific vision. Now, that's a Christian resource. I don't know if we can know that from pure philosophy.
Yeah.
But if we bring Christianity bare, I think it gives that extra perspective, which of course I believe is true and correct.
Yeah.
And then of course, once we have the beatific vision, we're deified, right?
Yeah,
like our
right.
nature is by grace elevated. So now it's just a different category of thing. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. That really helped when you said, if you have something that looks like a lion, but it's not eating gazelles, it's not a lion. So
it's not a lion. I don't know what that thing is. I mean, it's fine. It's cool, but it's not a lion, right? Uh-huh.
Yeah. No, fair enough. That's a good answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just think about like the good of having nomic regularity or natural regularities. Like this is a good thing, right? Without it, like we couldn't have science, we couldn't solve problems, we couldn't overcome obstacles, we couldn't become heroes, we couldn't form relationships. So it just seems like having an order with natural regularities and structures that, yes, can lead to earthquakes and people being in the wrong place a long time is itself a really good thing, right? And God can aim, of course, at that order without intentionally aiming to get somebody caught into an earthquake as well. So I think the more you think about the value and the goodness of having these natural regularities, again, you would not want to hit that button. You would say, no, I would rather have this than not. And if you would rather have it than not, then certainly God understands that better than we do, right? And which means he has a good reason to instantiate this world, right? Because it's good.
Yeah.
It's good, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is what Genesis 1 says,
That's exactly right. So I think it's completely consistent with Genesis on that front. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I keep bringing up over here. We're more theology people at the Logos Project, so that's why I wanted to have more philosophy discussions. But
yeah, and of course they blend, right? Especially the boundaries are never so cut and dry. I try to keep them distinct, as far and as long as I can.
Yeah.
But look, if somebody is bringing the problem of evil against the Christian paradigm, then the Christian is certainly entitled to use the Christian resources to respond, right?
No, absolutely. Yeah. So I had this massive argument with a friend of mine, and I was actually arguing against the hypothesis that free will was the reason why God allowed moral evil. I argued that it was basically a modern conception of freedom, and that if you understand freedom in the classical way, that God can ensure our attainment of the good and our not choosing evil while maintaining our freedom. So I guess that's a long way to say.
It's a long way to say that you don't like the free will defense.
Exactly.
I think that's right. So,
okay.
I mean, this is where I actually think that an atheist, prominent one, is pretty correct. Like J.L. Mackie, he's got his famous text called Evil and Omnipotence, which presses a strong form logical problem of evil, which, by the way, Mackie later backed away with. And he said, I don't think this works. And then he kind of went more the evidential route.
Okay.
So, but yeah, no, Mackie brings up the point. It's like, hey, it just seems like God could create creatures that just freely chose the right thing all the time, right? And I think certainly good philosophy and good Catholicism should have you agree with Mackie on that. And here's why. First off, when it comes to freedom in the contemporary debate and libertarian agency, there's different conditions that people think need to be met. One is called the PAP. It's a weird term for it. PAP just means principle of alternative possibilities. Do we need to be able to have chosen other than we did to be substantially free? And a lot of thinkers reject this, and certainly I think Aquinas would have rejected that as well. Rather, to be substantially free just means that you're kind of a source of your own action, right? That there's no sort of external coercion on that. Okay. All right. So why should we think that the more traditional and Thomistic view of freedom is correct? Well, first off, let's think about God. We think God is perfectly free, but he's also impeccable, that it's like impossible that God could lie. But do we think that God not being able to lie makes God any less free? No. In fact, we think God is like the paradigm of perfect freedom, right? All right. So yeah, I think if we want to make sense of divine freedom, we should probably be more careful about how we think about freedom, for one thing, right? God is impeccable. Now, the reason God is impeccable is because God just is subsistent goodness itself, right? God's nature just is pure goodness as such, right? So whatever God does, however God acts, it's always going to be in accord with his nature, right? So only God is sort of his own moral rule. Only God is the moral rule, if you will, right? Okay. Now, where do I think we can still get some juice from the free will defense, or what I've called the soft free will defense?
Yeah.
We'll get into this, but let's do some. This is where I think, again, having a deeper metaphysics really helps. So God is purely actual, and there can only be one purely actual being, as the traditional proofs have shown, because God is absolutely simple. There can only be one absolutely simple being, and so on and so forth. So God is what we would call uniquely unique. And that means that sort of anything else God creates is not at all in any way going to be like God. It's always going to be a metaphysical composite of act and potency. Okay. Well, potency is what makes privations possible. And privations is sort of what we think about as evils, right? Evil, whatever else evil is metaphysically, it's not on the same par as goodness, right? Evil is traditionally seen as a do good gone missing, right? It's something that should be there, but isn't. Think of like blindness or a hole in a sock. On the moral level, it's lack of conformity and a judgment to the moral rule or the moral standard. So there's something in the order of judgment that's missing that should be there. That's sort of the metaphysical analysis of sin, right? So it's still a privation, something that should have been there, a potentiality that should have been actualized but wasn't. So you need potency, right, in order to kind of serve as the metaphysical foundation for even the possibility of evil. Well, here's the thing. God don't have no potency, right? So there's not going to be any evil in God, but all of creation by default has potency.
Yeah.
Which means all of creation by default is going to have the possibility of failures, of defects, of evil, and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Now, what am I getting at? What I'm getting at is this. Only God's will is impeccable. Any other will that God creates that is free is going to be subject to the possibility of failure. It's not an impeccable will by nature. There's only one impeccable will by nature. That's God's.
Yeah.
That's God's, right? You see where I'm going with this?
Yes, I do.
All right. So yeah, and I think there's some cool upshot here, right? All right. What does God want? Well, we know, especially if we're going in the Christian paradigm, that God is just pure love, right? And God is aiming in creation for friendships, communion, and love. I think Jacques Maritain was great on this. He said, what God is aiming for predominantly is friendships, communion, and love with us, right?
Yeah.
However, to have that, you need the uniting of two independent wills, right? You need that for love. That's one of the necessary conditions for love.
Yeah.
However, only one will by nature is impeccable. All other wills by nature could fail. They could not consider the moral rule. They could engage in voluntary ignorance. They could turn away.
Yeah.
Right? Because they always sort of have to look beyond themselves. God doesn't have to look beyond himself. He is perfection. We're not, right?
Yeah.
We're fallible.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, here's where we have to be careful. Could God give us special graces to always choose the right thing? Yeah. And we think in some cases he might just have done that. He did do it with Our Lady, right?
Yeah.
So God could sort of give us a little something extra, if you will, over and above our nature to make sure that we never do fail. So now we want a story of, well, why wouldn't God do that? And it goes back to the idea that God is not just a creator, he's a governor. And he's a perfectly wise governor. And a perfectly wise governor in the general run is going to run things according to their nature, right?
Yeah.
He's not going to be performing constant miracles. Why? Because there's value in regularity. So all this ties together, right? Constant miracles is just, it's like miracles are good here and there, right? They give signs, they point, they signal, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But they're exception cases. They're not the general rule. A wise God governs things according to their nature. What's our nature? It's a fallible liberty, right? God guides us accordingly. He guides us in a way that we can fail, right?
Yeah.
Knowing that from our failures, he can draw even greater goods from it, right? Greater goods such as compassion, mercy, empathy, even the theological aspects, the incarnation itself, the atonement. These are like supremely good goods that it's hard to see how we could have those if God at least didn't permit the possibility of our failure.
Oh, Felix culpa. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. That's and Plantinga, who's a proponent of the free will defense, takes that up. I don't think you need Plantinga's free will defense to appreciate that insight, right? Which is, of course, Augustine's traditional insight as well, right?
Yeah.
So God, in aiming for love, is just sort of a metaphysical condition, right? A necessary metaphysical condition that he's going to have to bring in independent wills that always could fail. And a wise God is going to govern things accordingly. We have failed. Duh. Nobody would deny that. But God, in his omnipotence, in his greatness, in all of his awesomeness, is able to work with those failures to bring about even greater goods. Not just goods among humans and relationships among humans and heroes' journeys, but goods in relation to God himself. That's what I call the soft free will defense, because it concedes that God, in his absolute power, right, could have, made, I guess, blessed virgins of us all. But there's a principled reason why God, in his ordained power, in relation to God's wisdom and providence, does not do that.
That's awesome.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I love that. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Let's see. So we could take this in so many directions. One thing I wanted to run by you real quick.
And by the way, real quick, obviously in heaven, we think we can't sin, but we're still perfectly free. In fact, we think we've reached our...
Yeah.
And so again, like if you're a Christian, just be very careful with the general free will defense, right? You think you might be solving a problem up front, but giving yourself all sorts of bigger problems downstream, right?
Yeah, no, that was one of my points, which what about in heaven? Are we not free? Like, how does that make sense? So, yeah.
Yeah, so what we should say is that God wants to govern us according to our nature, and our nature is that we have a fallible freedom of choice through which we should reach our terminal freedom.
That's right.
So differentiate freedom of choice of terminal freedom.
Yeah.
In heaven, where once we have full possession of the good, and since the intellect is by nature determined to the good as such, not any particular finite good, but once we have the good as such, we'll always want it, right?
Yeah.
It'd just be impossible for us to turn away from the supreme good that is God, even if we can sort of contingently self-determine ourselves among any particular finite good, because it isn't the good as such, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, because to be human is to be a creature of becoming, but with a telos, and so it fits the narrative of what we are, so it makes sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, this is why just doing good metaphysics, right, solves so many problems. Like having done the metaphysics of the tradition. When I say the tradition, I mean like Big Tent Platonism with like Aquinas at the as the captain of the ship, right?
Yeah.
It just helps you to like see right through so many of the pseudo problems of contemporary philosophy and contemporary philosophy of religion, including like problems of evil and stuff like that. Like if you've done the metaphysics, and I think you should have a better understanding of what a human being is and human free will and God's absolute versus God's ordained power, that these solutions they should just kind of be clear to you, that you can see a sort of easy way to just dissolve the problem of evil, right?
No, yeah, that's awesome. One line of thought that I've heard before is that evil, because it's a negation, because it's the absence of goodness or existence, there's a sense in which the question, why does God allow evil, is almost like a bad question, because evil doesn't really have an explanation, doesn't have a reason for itself. And it seems to me that, and this is something someone else said, I think it might have been Balthazar or someone else, that what Christ does in his death is he brings meaning to what is essentially meaningless. And so he brings a kind of a love in the face of a nihilism that is almost indomitable, and he does conquer it anyway. I mean, what do you think about that line of thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so again, we talk about problems of evil. So we've been thinking about, well, why would God create a world with evil and suffering? And we're kind of considering that very, very broadly of like, does God have morally sufficient reasons to really allow us to suffer?
Yeah.
And so we've been considering it from that perspective, but there's a deeper metaphysical perspective, right? Where God is the positive cause of anything with being. Evil exists, so is God the cause of evil. And that's where the privation solution comes in. It says, no, evil doesn't exist like acorns exist, right? Evil, we would probably say, is just a logical being, right? Now, we have to be careful. We're not saying that like it doesn't make a difference, right? The hole in your sock makes all the difference on a cold day, right?
Yeah.
But it's not something that has positive ontological status, right?
Yeah.
It's being that's missing. So in that sense, it doesn't require a cause. Like an acorn requires a cause. And so that sort of gets God off the hook metaphysically of the metaphysical problem of evil, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. So
once again, it's problems of evil. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I heard you once talk about how maybe this can be flipped onto the offense when it comes to talking to the atheist. How might maybe the problem of evil actually help us in our case for theism? Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I think we already said that a little bit at the beginning when we do the sort of worldview comparison, and just ask, hey, honestly, what worldview would we even expect a problem of evil to begin with? And now I want to go back to that because I said we could even concede that maybe we think it's low given the existence of God, but it's still far more expected on theism than atheism. In that case, that evidential point counts towards theism rather than atheism.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's low. I don't think that we should have a low expectation of evil on theism. I think it's high, if not virtually certain, right? Why? For all the reasons that we considered. Like when we consider what the nature of the material world is, that is some things decrease, other things decrease, how God would govern fallibly free creatures, right? And what the likelihood is that we would fail, and how God would providentially arrange that to even greater goods. I mean, to me, the deeper I've thought about this is like, no, it just seems like, yeah, it's either really high or virtually certain that the type of world that we would see, given the existence of God as understood by classical theists, is exactly the world that we do see. And I think that only sort of strengthens the case. You can go further, of course, and make specific kind of moral arguments against the naturalist. Some are easier than others to make. I mean, I think if you focus on just certain aspects of our moral experience, the naturalists have a darn hard time trying to give any explanatory account of that. Moral knowledge is a good one. It seems like moral knowledge is really hard to account for in naturalism. Like even if you want to give a naturalist the resources to secure an objective moral landscape of moral facts, I think they're going to have a really hard time trying to explain how any sort of Darwinian process sort of lines us up to the right moral facts.
Gotcha.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It seems like the process is unreliable in a way that it would seem to provide defeaters of all moral knowledge. So if you think we actually do have moral knowledge, then theism is a far better explanation of that.
Yeah.
Or even human dignity, right? Or personal dignity, human dignity. Again, I think that's a really core commitment of many of us, including many atheists. And we can ask, okay, well, what worldview has better explanatory oomph for predictive success here? And again, I think that the atheist or naturalist is really going to struggle. So when it comes to making moral arguments for God, that's the way I like to do it. In addition to everything I just said, is just focus on particular aspects of our moral experience that I think any naturalistic paradigm has an enormously hard time explaining, and showing how sort of abductively the theistic hypothesis can make easy and great sense of our moral experience as a whole in comparison to naturalism, which I think fails on multiple points, but more obviously so in certain cases than others.
Gotcha. Wow. So so at the end of the day, the theist has answers to these puzzles. Not only that, but within the theist framework, the world that we do indeed have actually seems to be what we should expect, as opposed to the naturalistic point of view. It's not really a puzzle. It's more of the question itself kind of becomes nonsensical. Like, what do you mean the problem of evil? If you're a naturalist, there is no such thing as a moral judgment on what is good or evil, right?
Well, this is where you want to be careful, because I mean there are many naturalists who are nihilists, right? Who just take Darwin's dilemma and say, yeah, the worldview of Darwin is that universal acid that just sort of eats through everything. So in the same way that all naturalists are sort of committed to the idea that natural selection put this false belief about God into us, it seems to also have put false beliefs about morality into us. So morality is something that we invent rather than project, right?
Yeah.
And many naturalists, atheists, old and new, say that. I mean, going back to Nietzsche up to like Alex Rosenberg, yeah, they're just saying that morality is an illusion, right? So any sort of moral judgments you make, they're not really secured by anything beyond our head, right? Anything beyond these sort of useful fictions that helped us to survive. However, there's a number of naturalists, specifically ethicists, who think more deeply about morality and realize, oh, yeah, no, that just seems like too high of a bullet to bite. I need to try and get my naturalistic theory to account for objective morality in some sense. Now, look, there's a lot of different attempts out there, and certainly some really valiant ones. I don't think any of them work at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But certainly as theists, we should acknowledge that those attempts are being made. So we don't want to be too quick to say that all atheists say that morality is illusion, because that's not true. There's many naturalists out there who think that they can give some type of story to try and hold on to objective moral values and duties and obligations and all of that. And, these accounts differ of what they are. I don't think any of them work at the end of the day. That's why I like to focus on certain aspects of moral experience, because especially like moral knowledge, I think any naturalistic account, it really struggles with that one.
Yeah.
But they're kind of in tension with one another, because like Joe Atheist on the street, I was talking to Joe Atheist on Twitter the other day, and it seems like his natural expectation as an atheist is that all morality is an illusion. And it's only the kind of like naturalists in philosophical circles that realize the costs of saying something like that they then, and I think are pretty ad hoc, right? And trying to like wire certain aspects back into a naturalistic paradigm so they don't have to give that up. Again, I don't think any of it works.
Yeah.
But there are attempts out there being made for sure.
It's like you need so many stills to hold up your paradigm that, why not just pick a better paradigm? But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I agree, right? As soon as a naturalist starts like trying to bring back in elements of Platonism and Aristotelianism to make sense of morality, it's like, to me, you're waving the white flag at this point. Come on, guys.
It seems to me that Plato really, he understood that ultimately, if you're going to ground morality in the ultimate good, you can't have a naturalistic world. And ultimately, that was his political endeavor, was to ground the political project in the transcendent so that it could actually move forward in history. And I think that the naturalists are kind of faced with that. Like, you don't have any grounds for your stuff to, go up and running.
I mean, look, both Plato and Aristotle were theists, right? So to me, it's like their kind of systems are something of a package deal, and it always just seemed a bit illegitimate for naturalists to want to go and just like take bits of it, right? Yeah. Like essences or natures, and I think that's right. I think an Aristotelian essentialism can help us do a lot of moral work just thinking about what human nature is and what causes us to flourish, even without immediately thinking about God.
Yeah.
But I think I would just say you can't make sense of essentialism apart from theism, right? So
yeah.
And plus Darwinism was supposed to deal death to essentialism anyways.
Yeah.
So if you're a naturalist committed to Darwinism and now you're bringing back in essentialism, there's just all these tensions and inconsistencies where a theist doesn't have any of these problems. We can hold to evolution and still have essentialism.
Yeah.
And this stuff gets pretty knotty quick, but yeah, at the end of the day, I would say on deep evaluation of any of the atheistic paradigms that try to hold on to morality, many of them don't.
Yeah.
They're stuck with insuperable difficulties on many fronts. Yeah.
Yeah. It becomes more of a kind of practical power struggle, thing that men make up in order to shape the world, but it has nothing to do with the transcendent.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I was a naturalist for many years. We didn't kind of talk about my background here, but it was going deeper into naturalistic paradigms that caused me to abandon naturalism, because I just thought that they were explanatorily inadequate on many, many fronts, and morality and our moral experience is just one of them.
Yeah. Awesome. Fascinating. Wow. There's a lot here for the audience to chew on. This is good. Maybe I'm trying to find a good way to bring this to a conclusion, kind of a summary of the whole, what we talked about and why the problem of evil is a puzzle, but it's one that the theistic paradigm answers the best. I mean, it's pretty much what we talked about.
Well, I'll say this. I think the only ultimately satisfying solution to the problem of evil, not as a philosophical concern, but as an existential concern, is Christianity, right?
Yes.
Because what does Christianity promise us? It promises us a good that can trump any of the afflictions of this life. That's our hope, right? That the good that we are striving towards, right, and that many of the afflictions of this life are meant to cause us to yearn for, right? The beatific vision, is the good that trumps everything else, right? It is the trump card at the end of the day, right? That perfection and the unending perfection and bliss that we will have with union with God in the life hereafter is what trumps, is what defeats all the evils and suffering in this life. So I would say, just kind of to circle back to the existential aspect and the pastoral aspect, the only solution on that front that I've ever found plausible, and of course it's not something that we experience here, right? It is our hope. It is our Christian hope, right? Mm-hmm. But it's a well-grounded hope, and it's one that seems to provide a principled solution to the experiential side of the problem of evil. And for that reason, I think if you want to move beyond the philosophical analysis, it gives good reason to take Christianity seriously for everybody, because we all take the problem of evil seriously as an existential concern.
Yeah. That's phenomenal. Great way of apologetic, using philosophy to lead to theology, to lead to revelation. Yeah. So, where can the audience find out more about your work? And do you have any upcoming projects that you want them to know about?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me, if you're interested in philosophy, you might like my new YouTube channel called Philosophy for the People. My original podcast is the very humbly and originally named Pat Flynn Show. You can find that on iTunes. We have all sorts of conversations there, but a fair amount of philosophy and theology as well. Yeah, a number of projects coming up. I've got one article that was recently under revise and resubmit, so I'm optimistic that will be accepted, and that's on a sort of contemporary Thomistic cosmological argument for God. I'll be submitting a contribution to a new volume that should be coming out maybe towards the end of this year on from the journal Religions, and I'll be making a case for a Thomistic version of the PSR as necessary to affirm the intelligibility of the universe and why we can't really escape that and how that entails God's existence. So those are some things that I've been working on. Book project with my friend Dr. Gavin Kerr. We have a book due out probably later this year from Catholic Answers, tentatively titled Aquinas' Little-Known Way to God. And that's where we look at Aquinas' De Ente and say, you should understand his De Ente if you want to get a unified interpretation of all of his 5 ways. And then we go through the 5 ways, say like, look, we got to understand the 5 ways through the lens of the De Ente. So that'll be I guess a good introductory book to people on Aquinas' natural theology. Don't have any definitive release dates for any of this stuff, but they're all in the crock pot, so to speak.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, Pat, thank you so much for coming on the show, and audience, thanks for tuning in. And check out Pat's content and leave us a review and support us at patreon.com/The Logos Project. And we'll see you guys next week. Thanks.
Welcome to the Logos Project, a podcast on philosophy, theology, and culture.
There is a unique challenge posed to the church by modern culture that it has never faced before.
To be a person is to be called into supernatural communion with God.
The basic claims of a Nazarene who dies on the cross and explodes in a way that actually vindicates all the aspirations of the myths of all nations prior to him.
Dude, that was actually fascinating.
For the Lord has created a new thing on the earth. A woman encompasses a man. A fertile womb, a garden, out of which comes a new Adam, a new virgin soil. It's a new creation.
From Plato to Heidegger, from Nicaea to Vatican II, and from the Fathers to 20th century theology, the Logos Project seeks to bring beauty, goodness, and truth to your life.